Picture a Tuesday morning in rural Pennsylvania. The kind of morning where frost still clings to the windshields at 8 o'clock, where wood smoke drifts from chimneys along roads that have no names on most maps, where neighbors wave from driveways without really seeing each other. The kind of morning that belongs to no one in particular. The kind of morning that, in this particular corner of Bucks County, Pennsylvania, would later be remembered as the last ordinary one anyone in that community would ever truly experience. The year was 2000. The leaves had already turned and fallen. The fields outside of Perkasie, a quiet borough tucked into the folds of southeastern Pennsylvania, had gone brown and flat. Children were back in school. Families had settled into the rhythms of autumn. And somewhere in that unremarkable Tuesday, a life ended not by accident, not by the random cruelty of the universe, but by someone who ate breakfast that same morning, who perhaps kissed someone on the cheek, who looked into a mirror and made a choice. For more than 2 decades, the answer to what happened lived inside a single person. The community moved around it. Investigators circled it. A family fractured beneath its weight. And the question that hung over every subsequent year, every holiday dinner, every quiet night in that part of Pennsylvania was the same one that would not let go. How do you live inside the truth for 20 years and still look people in the eye? The borough of Perkasie sits in Bucks County like a secret the rest of Pennsylvania forgot to tell anyone about. It is the kind of place where the local diner has had the same pie selection since 1987, where the high school football team's banner still hangs outside the hardware store 3 seasons after the championship, where everyone's grandmother went to the same church. Population just over 8,000 in the year 2000. 2 traffic lights on the main road. A single pharmacy. A park with a bandstand that hosted summer concerts no one quite remembered attending, but everyone somehow knew about. Lisa Solan was 31 years old in the autumn of 2000. She had lived in Perkasie most of her life, save for 2 years at a community college in Doylestown, where she studied early childhood education, a degree she had finished but never quite put to use the way she had imagined. She worked part-time at a daycare center on Branch Road, 4 mornings a week, Tuesday through Friday, arriving at 7:45 and leaving by noon. She was, by every account given later by the people who knew her, the kind of person who remembered things about you. Your kid's soccer game, your mother's surgery, the name of your dog. She had 2 children. Dylan was 7. Cara was 4. Dylan was in 2nd grade at Sellersville Elementary, 17 minutes by car from the family home on Orchard Mill Road, a 2-story colonial with green shutters and a flagstone path that Lisa had planted with creeping phlox the previous spring. Cara was home with Lisa on Tuesday mornings, the 2 of them moving through their routine with the easy, unthinking choreography of a mother and small child who have memorized each other completely. Lisa's husband, Raymond Solan, was 34. He worked in facilities management for a manufacturing plant in Lansdale, a 40-minute commute that took him east on Route 113 before cutting south. He left the house by 6:15 on weekday mornings always. Neighbors would later recall the particular sound of his truck, a dark green Ford F-150, 1998 model, starting in the driveway before the sun was fully up. He was a quiet man, people would say. Not unfriendly, just contained. The kind of person you had a perfectly pleasant conversation with at the block party and then could not quite picture the face of an hour later. On the morning of November 7, 2000, the temperature in Perkasie was 38 degrees at dawn. By 9 o'clock it had climbed to 44. There was a light wind from the northwest. The sky was the particular shade of pewter gray that belongs specifically to Pennsylvania in November, low and flat, like a ceiling pressed down just slightly too far. Lisa dropped Dylan at school at 8:03. The school's sign-in log, reviewed later meticulously by investigators from the Bucks County Detective Bureau, confirmed the time. The crossing guard, Margaret Howell, who had worked that post for 11 years, told investigators she remembered Lisa that morning because Cara had been wearing a bright orange coat, the color of a highway cone, and Howell had thought to herself that it was a cheerful thing on a gray day. Lisa waved from the car window. Dylan ran through the gate. The green-shuttered Colonial was 12 minutes away. At 9:17, Lisa called her sister, Janet Marsh, who lived in Quakertown. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds according to phone records retrieved the following week. Janet would later say the conversation was ordinary. Lisa mentioned that she needed to pick up milk, that Cara had a small cough, that Dylan had a spelling test Friday. There was nothing in her voice. Janet would insist for years afterward, nothing that suggested anything was wrong. At 11:50, Raymond Solan called the daycare center on Branch Road to leave a message for Lisa about an adjustment to their dinner plans. The receptionist who answered, a woman named Sandra Pruitt, told him Lisa had not come in that morning. She had not called. Her Tuesday shift had gone uncovered, which was unusual enough that Pruitt had already left a voicemail on the home phone. Raymond told investigators he assumed there had been a miscommunication. He did not call the house immediately. He finished his lunch. He returned to his desk. He called the house at approximately 12:35. No answer. He called again at 1:15. No answer. He called Janet Marsh at 1:42. "Is Lisa with you?" he asked. She was not. By 2:30, Raymond Solan left work early. He arrived home on Orchard Mill Road at 3:21. The house was locked. His key worked in the front door. Inside, the television in the living room was off. The kitchen showed the remnants of a morning, a coffee mug on the counter, a sippy cup beside the sink, Cara's cereal bowl still damp from a recent rinsing. Everything was in its place. Nothing was broken. Nothing was overturned. Cara's orange coat was on its hook by the back door. Raymond called the Perkasie Police Department at 3:44. Clear's throat. The swing in the backyard hung perfectly still. A small plastic truck, the kind with the yellow dump bed, lay on its side in the grass near the garden border. The flagstone path was empty. The creeping phlox, frost-burned and browning, lay flat along both sides. And somewhere between the school drop-off and the start of a Tuesday shift, Lisa Solan and her 4-year-old daughter had walked out of the life they had been living and did not come back. The milk never got picked up. The message about dinner was never heard. The first officers on scene were from the Perkasie Borough Police, a department of 14 officers at the time, including the chief. They arrived at 3:51 and walked through the house with Raymond Solan, who showed them the coffee mug, the cereal bowl, the orange coat. He was cooperative. He answered every question asked of him. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded and spoke in measured sentences. One of the responding officers, whose later affidavit would become part of the court record, noted in his initial report that Mr. Solan's affect was calm and organized. Not a clinical term, not an accusation, just an observation written down. By evening, the Bucks County Detective Bureau had been notified. A missing persons investigation was opened for Lisa Solan, age 31, and Cara Solan, age 4. Descriptions were circulated. Lisa was 5'4", brown hair past her shoulders, hazel eyes. Cara was small for her age, with her mother's same brown hair and a small scar above her right eyebrow from a fall off the porch steps the previous summer. The green Ford F-150's odometer had been read at the plant's parking lot that morning by a facilities supervisor who happened to document vehicle mileage as part of a routine maintenance checklist. It read 47,842 miles at 6:15 in the morning. When investigators examined the truck 3 days later, it read 47,844. Raymond Solan had driven, according to that reading, approximately 2 miles since leaving for work that Tuesday morning. His stated route to and from Lansdale would account for just over 80 miles round trip. The investigators noted this. They noted it quietly. Raymond drove a second vehicle, a 1996 Honda Accord, silver, registered in both his and Lisa's names, which was also parked at the property. Its odometer was reviewed as well. Between a documented service visit on October 28th and the examination on November 10th, it had traveled approximately 211 miles. Raymond's explanation was that Lisa used the Accord for local errands. He could not account for the specific miles. Those who knew him said Raymond Solan was not the type of man who raised his voice, not the type to cause a scene. A former co-worker at the Lansdale plant, interviewed by a Bucks County detective approximately 10 days after the disappearance, said Raymond had seemed totally normal the day of November 7th, had eaten his lunch, had attended a 2 o'clock scheduling meeting, had spoken about a project deadline with the same focus he always brought. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about a husband who did not cry during the first full week. Search teams were organized through the Bucks County Emergency Services Unit, with assistance from neighboring municipalities, volunteers from the Perkasie community, and they came in numbers that moved people to describe it later as one of the things they were proud of. Searched the parks, the creek trails, the wooded areas along the Perkiomen watershed. Church groups organized shifts. The high school principal sent a note home with every student. Local businesses posted flyers in their windows. The diner on Main Street kept a photograph of Lisa and Cara near the register for months. The search found nothing. Clear's throat. Canine units were brought in on November 9th and again on November 14th. The dogs showed interest in 2 locations, a stretch of trail along Branch Creek about 2 miles from the Solan home, and the interior of the silver Honda Accord. That second detail, the Accord, was noted in investigative logs. Evidence technicians processed the vehicle. They found what was described in the Bucks County Detective Bureau's case file as trace biological material consistent with human contact in the trunk lining. The laboratory analysis at the time, this was the year 2000, with the forensic technology available then, was inconclusive regarding source identification. Raymond Solan, when asked about the trunk, said Lisa sometimes put grocery bags back there, that Cara had once spilled a juice box back there on the way home from the grocery store. He was helpful. He offered explanations freely. He never hired an attorney in those first weeks. He gave 2 full voluntary interviews to Bucks County detectives in November of 2000. In the first, he described his marriage as solid. In the second, asked about any recent tensions, he said there had been some stress about finances. Nothing unusual, nothing serious. He answered every follow-up question. In December, with no bodies recovered and no conclusive physical evidence sufficient for charges, the visible investigation began to slow. Media attention, which had been concentrated through November, diffused toward other stories. The volunteers who had given weekends in November returned to their lives. The flyers faded in the hardware store window. A woman named Patricia Geller, who lived 3 properties down Orchard Mill Road from the Solan house, would later tell investigators she had seen the silver Accord parked at the house on the morning of November 7th at approximately 10:45. She was walking her retriever, a habit she had every Tuesday morning. The car had been there. She thought nothing of it. Why would she? Married women park in their own driveways. But Lisa had been due at work at 7:45. The daycare had no record of her arriving. Between 8:03, when the crossing guard saw her wave from the driver's window, and 11:50, when the receptionist confirmed she had never arrived, there was a window. And in that window, the silver Accord had been parked in its own driveway at 10:45. Patricia Geller did not come forward with this until March of 2001. She had not known it mattered. She had not known what window it fit into. By then, the investigation had formally stalled. Lisa and Cara Solan were listed as missing persons. The case file was thick and unresolved. The community held a candlelight gathering on the one-year anniversary. People cried in the park bandstand, the same one no one quite remembered from the summer concerts. Dylan Solan, now 8 years old, sat between his grandparents and held a candle. Raymond Solan stood at the edge of the crowd. He did not cry then either. In the spring of 2002, Raymond Solan sold the house on Orchard Mill Road. The new owners, a young couple from Doylestown, repainted the shutters. They pulled up the frost-killed creeping phlox and planted ornamental grass. They had no children yet and did not know the history, or if they did, they chose the house anyway, the way young couples in new love sometimes choose things with their eyes open and their hearts deciding. Raymond moved to Montgomery County with Dylan. They rented a townhouse in Lansdale, a 20-minute drive from the plant. Raymond's parents, who lived nearby, helped with Dylan's school pickups and the practical architecture of a single father's week. Dylan, who had been 7 when his mother and sister disappeared, was now 9. He was small for his age. He was quiet in the way children become quiet when they have been carrying something too heavy for their frame. Those who saw Dylan during those years describe him with a particular uniformity of language, the kind of consistency that suggests they are all trying to tell you something without being able to say it directly. He was a sweet kid. He was very well behaved. He was never any trouble. He asked, apparently, very few questions about his mother and sister in public settings. His teachers at the Lansdale Elementary School noted in their records that he did well in structured environments and became visibly uncomfortable when lessons involved family-themed projects. His third-grade teacher, whose name was Mrs. Dorian Kelleher, assigned a family tree project in October of 2002. Dylan drew his mother's branch with a careful, deliberate pencil line and then quietly erased it. He told Mrs. Kelleher he did not know what to put there. She sat with him after class and let him talk if he wanted to. He did not want to. He drew, in those years, a great deal. His grandmother, Raymond's mother, kept a folder of his drawings. She would not describe most of them in detail in later years, except to say that they sometimes depicted things that made her feel cold. Clears throat. Raymond Solan remarried in 2004. A woman named Teresa Connell, who worked in the administrative offices of the same manufacturing plant in Lansdale, a woman who had, by all external evidence, no knowledge of what Raymond knew. She was 37. She was warm by account. She was good to Dylan, who by then was 11 and had settled into a quieter version of himself. They had a daughter together in 2006. The household on the Lansdale Townhouse Street looked, from the outside, like what happens when people survive difficulty and build something new. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, not in a dramatic or confrontational way, but in the small, persistent way that lives in the base of the stomach, the story of Teresa Connell in those years is among the more sobering chapters of this case. Because Teresa Connell believed her husband. She had married him in good faith. She raised a child with him. She attended Dylan's school events beside him. She built a life that required his story to be true, that Lisa had left, that Cara had gone with her, that they were out there somewhere and Raymond simply did not know where. In January of 2008, Raymond and Teresa separated. The reasons given publicly were generic: incompatibility, growing apart, the accumulated stress of a blended family situation. What Teresa told the investigators who would later come to speak with her was more specific. She described a marriage characterized, in its later years, by Raymond's unpredictability, by periods of intense control over the household's routines, by small corrections about how she drove, how she spent money, how she spoke to Dylan, that arrived with a frequency and a calmness that she said was more unsettling than anger would have been. He never raised his voice, she told the Bucks County detective who interviewed her in 2019. That was the thing. He would correct you, and he would be completely calm, and you would feel like you had done something terrible even when you couldn't find what it was. She paused. I didn't put it together for a long time, she said, and then one day I did. The interviewing detective noted that Teresa had filed for separation before making any contact with law enforcement. She had spent, she estimated, roughly 8 months sitting with what she had put together before she was willing to say it to anyone with a badge. I kept thinking I was wrong, she said. I kept thinking if I say this and I'm wrong, I've destroyed someone's life. And then I kept thinking, what if I'm right? Dylan Solan turned 20 in 2013. He had left Pennsylvania for a time, attending a college in Virginia on a partial academic scholarship. He returned to the Philadelphia area in 2016, taking work in IT support for a company in Blue Bell. He lived alone. He had, by most outward measures, constructed a functional, independent life. But there were the nights. There were the things that came up at the edges. A coworker who became close to Dylan in 2017 would later describe how Dylan would sometimes go very still in the middle of a conversation, as though something had arrived in his chest without warning. How he could not eat certain foods because they were associated with specific mornings from his childhood. How, on the anniversary of November 7th each year, he did not come to work. He had a therapist. He had been working with that therapist on something that the therapist later described in carefully worded, professionally appropriate language as unresolved experiential material that the patient had carried since early childhood, which began to clarify in his early 20s. Clarify. That is the word the therapist used. In 2018, at 25 years old, Dylan Solan sat in his therapist's office in Blue Bell and said something out loud for the first time. Something he had been carrying since he was 7 years old. Something he had seen, or heard, or understood in the fragmentary way that young children understand things that are too large for them. Understood it, and then built years of ordinary life around it the way a tree grows around a wire. What he said to his therapist, and then what he agreed to say to the Bucks County District Attorney's Office in the spring of 2019, is the reason this story exists. On March 14, 2019, a case file that had sat in the Bucks County District Attorney's cold case unit for nearly 19 years was pulled from its shelf and placed on an active investigator's desk. The reinvestigation of the disappearances of Lisa and Cara Solan was assigned to Senior Detective Mark Ashworth of the Bucks County Detective Bureau, a 22-year veteran who had spent the last 6 of those years working exclusively cold case reopenings. Clear's throat. The trigger was a letter, handwritten, sent by certified mail to the district attorney's office in Doylestown. It came from a therapist's office in Blue Bell. It stated, in careful clinical language, that a patient had become aware of information material to an unsolved case and wished to cooperate with investigators. The patient's name was Dylan Solan. Detective Ashworth drove to Blue Bell on the morning of March 21, 2019. He met Dylan at the therapist's office, a choice that had been made deliberately with the therapist's guidance to provide Dylan with a supported environment for what he was about to do. Dylan was 25 years old. He was, Ashworth noted in his case journal, composed but clearly carrying something significant. He sat forward in the chair. He kept his hands flat on his knees. Dylan spoke for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Ashworth recorded the interview with Dylan's full consent. What Dylan described was the morning of November 7th, 2000. He described it in the kind of detail that belongs to children, the specific, sensory, irrelevant-seeming detail that the adult brain edits out but the 7-year-old brain preserves in amber. He described the smell of the kitchen. He described the sound the cereal made in the bowl. He described his mother's voice saying his name at the breakfast table. And then he described what happened after his mother put him in the car. He described arriving at school. He described the crossing guard and the orange coat and running through the gate. He described, in careful and halting language, arriving back at the house that same morning, because he had forgotten his spelling workbook, because the teacher had asked students to bring it that day, and because the school's policy allowed children to return to retrieve forgotten materials within the first hour with a parent escort. His grandmother, Raymond's mother, was called by the school secretary when Dylan reported his forgotten workbook at 8:15. She drove from her house, 8 minutes away, collected Dylan, and drove him back to Orchard Mill Road. She had a key. She let herself in. She told Dylan to wait in the kitchen while she went to find the workbook in his room. Dylan did not wait in the kitchen. He went down the short hallway toward the garage door. He was 7. He was curious. He heard something. He later described it as a sound that he could not name when he was 7 years old, a heavy and particular sound from behind the closed garage door, and he did not open the door. He stood in the hallway. He stood there for what he later estimated to be less than a minute. His grandmother called his name from the top of the stairs. He went back to the kitchen. She came downstairs with the workbook. They left. His father's green truck was not in the driveway when they arrived. The silver Accord was. Dylan was 7. He told no one what he had heard. He did not know what it meant. He filed it in the place where children file things that frighten them, deep, wordless, weight-bearing, and he carried it for 18 years. He told his therapist, in the months before the letter was written, that he had always known and never known at the same time, that it had lived in him as a physical sensation, a pressure in his chest when certain dates arrived or certain sounds triggered it, without ever, until his early 20s, attaching itself to words he could say. He told me, Detective Ashworth recalled in his official deposition, that the hardest part was not knowing. The hardest part was knowing and not knowing what to do with knowing. Ashworth spent the following 6 months rebuilding the evidentiary architecture of the case. The forensic technology available in 2019 was comprehensively different from what had existed in 2000. The biological trace material from the trunk lining of the silver Accord, a sample that had been preserved, along with all physical evidence from the original investigation, in the Bucks County Evidence Storage Facility in Doylestown, was resubmitted to the Pennsylvania State Police Forensic Laboratory with a request for updated DNA analysis. The results came back on September 4, 2019. The biological material matched Lisa Solan. A secondary profile, consistent with a child, also emerged from the sample. Cara Solan's DNA profile, established from a toothbrush and hairbrush collected from the Orchard Mill Road house in 2000 and preserved in the evidence repository, was identified as consistent with the secondary profile. They had been in that trunk. Interviews were conducted or reconducted with 41 individuals over the 6 months between March and September of 2019. Teresa Connell, Raymond's former wife, was interviewed in August. She described in detail a marriage she had spent years reinterpreting. She described specific incidents. She described Raymond's refusal, in the final years of their marriage, to discuss Lisa or Cara except in the most surface and rehearsed of terms. She described finding, in 2007, a hand-drawn map in a box in the basement of the Lansdale townhouse. A map she did not understand and did not keep. A map she had mostly dismissed. A map she now described in as much detail as she could reconstruct. The map she described, in the opinion of Detective Ashworth, was consistent with an area of Bucks County bordering the upper stretch of the Perkasie Creek watershed, in an agricultural parcel approximately 4 miles north of the Branch Creek Trail, where the canines had shown interest in November of 2000. A ground search of that area was conducted in October of 2019 with cadaver-trained canines and ground-penetrating radar equipment. On October 22, 2019, human remains were located at a depth of approximately 4 feet in a section of the parcel bordered by a collapsed fencing line and mature scrub oak. Forensic odontology and DNA analysis confirmed the identities of the remains as Lisa Solan and Cara Solan. They had been there for 19 years. Clears throat. Raymond Solan was arrested on the morning of November 7, 2019. The date was not a coincidence. Detective Ashworth would say later simply that the timing felt necessary, that something about returning the case to the calendar of its origin felt right. He was taken into custody at his residence in North Wales, Montgomery County, where he had been living since a second separation from a third partner approximately 2 years earlier. He was 53 years old. He was, by all accounts of those who witnessed the arrest, completely calm. A neighbor who watched from her front porch told a local news outlet that he walked out the front door, looked at the officers, and did not say a word. He did not ask why. He did not express surprise. He just nodded, the neighbor said, like he had been waiting. He was transported to the Bucks County Correctional Facility in Doylestown and charged with 2 counts of criminal homicide, among other charges, in the deaths of Lisa Ann Solan and Cara Elizabeth Solan. The arrest made the front page of the Bucks County Courier-Times the following morning under the headline, "Arrest made in 19-year cold case." Regional television news ran the story through the evening cycle. The Associated Press picked it up. Within 48 hours, it had been covered by national outlets. In Perkasie, the reaction was not simple. There were those who had suspected for years, who had whispered at church and at the diner and at the school pickup line that something had never been right, that a man whose wife and child vanish without a trace from a locked house in the middle of a Tuesday morning and does not cry in public and sells the house and remarries and continues functioning, that such a man is either a victim of extraordinary circumstances or something far darker. These people felt on November 7, 2019, the complicated, sorrow-filled thing that is not quite relief but occupies the same space. And there were those who were genuinely stunned, who had coached Raymond's son in baseball for a season, who had stood next to Raymond at the candlelight gathering, who had accepted his calm explanations and his contained grief and his functional remarriage as evidence of resilience rather than of absence. For these people, the arrest produced a specific kind of distress, the distress of having believed someone, of having built your perception of events on their reported experience, and discovering that the foundation was not what you thought. I stood next to him, a longtime Perkasie resident told a local journalist. I put my hand on his shoulder at the candlelight vigil and I told him we were going to find them, and he said thank you, and he knew. Raymond Solan entered a plea of not guilty at his arraignment on November 12, 2019. He was represented by a defense attorney from Philadelphia. The case was prepared for trial through 2020 and into 2021, a process complicated by the disruptions of that period in the court system. Pre-trial hearings were held in Doylestown. Defense motions challenged the admissibility of certain evidence, including the DNA results from the 2019 reanalysis and the testimony of Lisa Solan. The motions were denied. In the fall of 2021, with the trial scheduled to begin in February of 2022, Raymond Solan changed his plea. He entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of degree homicide, among other related charges. Under the terms of the agreement, he was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in a Pennsylvania state correctional facility, with no eligibility for early release consideration until the minimum term was served. He would be 73 years old at earliest release. At the sentencing hearing in Doylestown in November of 2021, the courtroom was filled. Members of Lisa's family were present. Janet Marsh, Lisa's sister, read a victim impact statement in a voice that did not break, though those sitting nearby said her hands shook throughout. She spoke about Lisa's laugh. She spoke about Cara's orange coat. She spoke about the 21 years of not being able to bury them and the specific, un-English grief of that. She said at one point, "My sister was the person who remembered things about you, and we remembered everything about her. We were always going to remember." Lisa Solan was not in the courtroom. He was reported to be in contact with his mother's family. He had not spoken publicly about the case and had declined all media requests. His therapist noted, in a brief and carefully worded public statement after the sentencing, that Dylan was engaged in ongoing therapeutic work and that his cooperation with investigators had required extraordinary personal courage. Raymond Solan at sentencing made no statement. He nodded once when the judge addressed him. He was calm. He was always calm. There is a borough in southeastern Pennsylvania where the leaves still turn gold and brown every November, where the creek still runs cold over limestone, where the diner on the main road has had the same pie selection since long before any of this happened, where children still run through school gates in the morning, and parents still wave from car windows, and neighbors still wave from driveways without quite seeing each other. Life in Perkasie continued, the way life continues everywhere, because it has no alternative. But November in that town carries something now that it did not carry before the year 2000. A collective memory of what can live inside an ordinary house on an ordinary street. A lesson, not dramatic or instructive, but quiet and heavy, about how long a person can know something and say nothing, and how long a community can grieve without understanding what it is grieving. Lisa Solan was 31 years old and remembered things about you. Cara Solan was 4 years old and wore a coat the color of a highway cone on a gray morning, and a crossing guard thought it was a cheerful thing. They deserved more than 21 years in the ground. They deserved the ordinary Tuesday. They deserved the milk picked up and the dinner plans adjusted and the creeping flocks coming back in the spring. Clears throat. What this case means, finally, may be less about the legal machinery that eventually worked and more about a young man named Dylan who carried something unbearable from age 7 to age 25 and then, in a therapist's office in Blue Bell with his hands flat on his knees, decided that the truth was worth more than the silence. That the truth, however late, was owed. Justice, in this case, arrived 19 years behind schedule. It wore the face of a grown man who once was a boy in a hallway who heard a sound he could not name. It wore the face of a detective who kept going. It wore the face of a woman, Teresa Connell, who spent 8 months sitting with what she had put together before she was willing to say it. It wore the face of a crossing guard who remembered an orange coat. Memory is not nothing. Attention is not nothing. writing things down, the way Margaret Howell remembered which coat Cara was wearing, the way Patricia Geller remembered the silver Accord in the driveway. These acts of ordinary witness are not nothing. Lisa Solan was someone's sister. She was someone's mother. She was someone who planted creeping phlox along a flagstone path in the spring and did not live to see it bloom again. She is remembered,